Hi, John here, and in this video I want to just walk through some of my recent experiences in creating a customized deployment environment. Now, ordinarily, if I'm an on-premises and I'm deploying servers in a VM, the correct process really should be I have some storage, and let's say I'm Hyper-V, I have a VHD file. And that VHD file is a template. What it really contains is an operating system that has been sysprepped, i.e. it's ready for duplication. And when I want to create a new virtual machine, well, what I really want to do is I think about, well, this VHD file, I'm going to copy it, and then the new VM I create, I attach to this. It would start up. I could push an unattended answer file to it by maybe attaching it in an ISO file to it. I could inject it in the VHD. There's lots of things I could do. It would run through the specialized phase and my VM would be ready. So that's generally what I should be doing on-prem. This is very vanilla, doesn't have a lot of special configuration. I think about applying other config via PowerShell desired state configuration. I could push things with config manager, lots of different options. But I try not to customize this VHD too much. Maybe I just have the latest patches pushed into it. So that's an on-prem. And the benefit of doing this rather than, let's say, a Pixie boot where I pull the OS over the network is it's just a storage copy operation. Depending on what my storage is, this might be super fast, sublung cloning, not using any network connectivity here. So very, very fast, very, very efficient. If I was in Azure, it's a very similar thing. If I think about I'm in Azure and I want to create a new VM, there's a whole bunch of templates included in the marketplace, or I can upload my own VHD, I can mark it as an image, then really the same thing happens. I can think about I have, so we do this gold VHD file really sitting there, and when I say create a new VM off of that image, what it does is it really copies it to a new VHD, it creates a VM, it attaches it to that virtual machine. There's an unattended.xml file is connected to it as well. Really the way it does that is it puts it on a virtual CD drive, an ISO file, and that unattended file gets read in when the VM starts up. And that's again how I should deploy things in Azure. Again, PowerShell DSC, Chef Puppet to apply any special config. But the circumstances I had is I couldn't use either one of those. There was an existing process the customer had that was focused around PE, and they had literally years of investment in this process. And so they just wanted to be able to see about, well, how would I actually use that? How does that work in a PE? And I even tested it in Azure. Now, this is not recommended, don't know if it's supported. You should use templates in Azure. But I wanted to walk through really, how does this work when I use a custom PE environment to deploy a Windows operating system? So if we take a step back, so Windows PE is this pre-execution environment, pre-installation environment that when I deploy from media is used. When I first boot up, it's using PE. And I can get PE through the Windows Automated Deployment Kit, the ADK. If I download the ADK, there's 32-bit and 64-bit Windows PE environments on that media. So I install the ADK on a machine. I then open up a special command prompt, and I'm going to show this at the end. And what I say is I want to create a new PE environment. And when I do that, what actually happens is from that ADK on my file system, I give it a folder. So let's say under the C drive, I just say PE. And this command will inject a whole set of resources under that PE folder. And one of those is the boot.wim file. Now why this is important is eventually I'm going to kind of take this PE folder and I'm going to put it to something. Maybe an ISO file, maybe a USB, maybe a virtual hard disk. And what actually happens with PE is I can customize this boot.wim. The way I do that is I actually take that boot.wim and I mount it. So normally what I do is under this PE, I also create something called just a folder called mount. And what I then do is I mount the boot.wim as that folder. So I can now copy things to CPE mount, and it's actually going to make changes to the Wim. Now why I might want to customize that is maybe I want to add things like PowerShell. Maybe I want to add things like image X, so I can push down Wim files. Maybe I want to add in some kind of launch file. Because in this boot.wim there's a startnet.cmd. That's the things it runs when it boots into that PE environment. So what I wanted to do was launch my own piece of code. So I created an autolaunch.bat and I modified the startnet.cmd to call my batch file. Now it's very, very simple. All it did was connect to a file share, copy down a couple of files, and launch another batch file. And that other batch file actually had all the logic in it. Now the reason I did that is I wanted to be able to change the batch file without having to recreate this every single time. So this one was super simple. Literally all this batch file did was it would connect to a file share and then copy across some files which it would then launch. That's all it did. But now I could change that batch file whenever I wanted on the file share and change my logic, just restart the VM. Once you've done all this, you would dismount and say commit the changes. And then from this whole structure, I can either say, hey, I want you to create an ISO file, which I would put on a DVD, or you can kind of say, well, create a USB drive, or that could actually point to a VHD file that's been mounted. So now I'm creating a VHD file that contains Windows PE, which is exactly what I did in my environment. I wanted to be able to create a virtual environment that booted into PE initially. And that's exactly what I did. So I would take this, once I mounted it, customized it, committed it to the boot.wim file, and then said, okay, go and create me a VHD file. So now what I have is my shiny, let's just keep going over, I have my VHD. So I would copy that just like a template, so I'm actually now using this as a template. I would copy that to a new VHD file, and I would attach a VM to it. Now at this point you may be thinking, okay, I'm booting off of this VHD which has PE on it. But I want to take that same VHD and now pull down a Wim file with Windows Server, whatever. So how can I format the disk if I'm booting off of the disk? It's what's running the PE. What actually happens is, remember this boot.wim file, which is what I actually mounted and customized. So when PE boots, what it actually does is that boot.wim file, it extracts out into the X drive, which is a RAM disk. It's read-write, and that's what I'm actually running from. When I boot into PE, I'm not actually using that media anymore. It's extracted the boot.wim into a RAM drive, and it's read and writable. So that means I can now do the rest of my stuff. So my startnet.cmd would launch my auto launch file on here, which would copy things down from that file share, the rest of my script. And really all that script would do is also on that file share, I had a Wim file, so it would use image X, which I'd customized and copied into that boot.wim. So it's now sitting on the X drive. I would partition the disk, so I would clean the disk. So I'm basically wiping this out. So I would clean, then apply the image X. I would then inject an unattended answer file. So I'm going to put in an answer file into that new cleaned disk. And I'm done. I would then reboot. And that's all I was actually doing in this whole process that I'm going to quickly walk through for you. So just quickly to review, using the ADK, we create a PE structure that contains a boot.wim. That's the actual real PE environment. We mount that boot.wim so we can modify it. I added PowerShell and WMI tools and ImageX and a very simple batch file that connected to a file share that had a more complex batch file, and I saved that to the boot.wim. I then took the structure and I outputted it to a VHD file that I created. I mounted the VHD, that was my target. So now I had a VHD file with my customized PE environment. I now used that as my template to create new VMs. This will be on-prem. I tested it in Azure as well because I was having to experiment with these things. That customized VHD, when it boots, takes the boot.wim, expands it out to the RAM disk, which is X, which is read and writable. That's what's actually running the PE. From there, its built-in startnet.cmd called the batch file I wrote to that media. All that did was map to a file share and copy over a more complex set of script. The first thing it would do would be to clean the disk, create my new boot and system partitions. It would then use image X to apply whatever image I wanted to, like Windows Server 2016. It would then create an unattended answer file and inject it into that new expanded disk structure as well. And it would reboot. And now I'm using my own customized process. Now when I was messing around with this, I did some more complex stuff. Like when I tried this in Azure, I actually connected to the 169.254, 169.254, which is a RESTful endpoint. I can actually extract information about the VM from. So I would get the VM name, and I would add it to my unattended answer file. That's me using a customized PE environment. So now I'll actually show you this in action. So now I want to actually walk through it. So I'm going to use my blog article that I wrote up about this. It's on saviltech.com. And the link to it is in the YouTube video description. And so this walks through the detail of all of the various commands that I actually need to use. So I'm not going to focus on them in this video. You should actually go and look at the blog article and then I can copy the code directly. But what I have is a machine where I have the ADK installed. So if I go to my start, I can see I have all of the various ADK tools. This includes the deployment and imaging tools environment. This is probably the most critical thing we need to use. That and the system image manager if I want to create an unattended answer file. So here is the ADK, the imaging tools environment. And the first thing I want to do is actually create a Windows PE environment. So in the blog article, this is the copy PE AMD64 and then my target folder. So I've run that already and it generated this structure. I also created an empty folder called mount. So there's nothing in there, but this is what I'll use to actually mount the boot.wim file. So here I can actually see if I go into my media folder, I have a sources folder and there's the boot.wim. This is the actual PE environment. And so to demonstrate that, again right now the mount is empty, but I'm going to go ahead and from my article, it's the first line, the DISM mount image, the boot.wim into that empty mount folder. So I'm going to execute this. And that's going to go ahead and mount it. So it's complaining that it's already mounted for read-write access. So if you get into that position, I'm just going to unmount it with a discard. So I'm running DISM unmount image, that folder discard. So I've seen this happen sometimes. It gets confused. So here, that's an easy way to just say, hey, unmount the image. So this is saying, hey, look, there's some weird stuff going on. Maybe I'm still in that folder. So I'm going to come out of there. And we're going to try that again. So we'll try that dismount one more time. So I do see some strange things happen sometimes. The reason I'm not going to edit this out of the video is just because you want to see that happen. So actually going into the folder can cause it some problems. So I made sure I'm out of that in Explorer. We'll try and mount it one more time. And this time I think it should work. So what I should now see is it goes through and mounts it. So I'm mounting the first image, image number 1, from the boot.wim file, and I'm mounting it into my mount folder. So once that completes, I can now see the content of that boot.wim. I would then go and run the other commands in the blog post. So you can see I'm using the dism command. I'm adding a number of packages. The packages I'm adding are things like WMI, NetFX, scripting, PowerShell, storage WMI, the dism commandlets, and then I manually copy over ImageX, all of them into this mount folder. Then when I'm finished, I unmount it with a commit. I can see I've got those various files copied over. There's my ImageX. Now additionally, the blog article goes in stages, but I'm going to jump ahead a few parts because what I do later on is, well, I want to partition the disk. So what I do is I create a VHD file, which I've already done. I create a VHD file that I'm actually going to use later on. If I scroll down, later on, I need to actually partition the VHD with a true operating system. I need the system partition and a Windows partition. So I save this content into a file called parts.txt. And that's what I can see. I've copied it over onto the disk itself. Now I need to call that. So what I also then do is I create a very small file. This is an auto launch. Now I save this to a file share. Now I happen to actually save this to an Azure file share. I can still access that from on-prem because it's SMB3. And so what I do is, in my auto launch file, I call that parts.txt, which will clean the disk and then create two partitions. I then map to a file share. So this one shows me mounting to a local file share, but that could just as easily be an Azure file share. I would just use the correct username and password. And then initially I also did things like, well, I apply the ImageX, I make the new disk bootable. And then I call this from the start.net file that is part of a Windows PE. It's found in the Windows System 32 folder. But the challenge with that is every time I wanted to change it, I would have to create a new image. So instead, this is where I actually go and mount Azure Files. This is how I could actually go and create a new VM from it. But I change it to instead, my autolaunch.bat file now does the disk partitioning. It maps to Azure Files, then it copies over an image install.bat file from the file share and then just calls it. So that is the actual content I have as part of my image. That autolaunch.bat is the version I have further down the article that literally does nothing more than partition the disk, map to Azure Files, and then copies over a new image install.bat file to my local drive, my X, which is my PE read-write area, and then calls it. Now in that image install.bat file, which is on, if I go and look, my Azure Files, that's actually sitting on my file share along with my WIM file, my Unattended file, and also a PowerShell file. I'm going to get to these. Close that down. So that image install.bat on the file share, which I can now change whenever I want, put new content in because it gets pulled down dynamically. That applies the install.wim file. That applies the BCD boot. That then creates the Panther folder under Windows. Remember, it's the W drive letter right now because I'm still in PE. I then copy over a template unattend.xml file into that Panther folder. And then I want to customize the unattend file. So in this example, I call a PowerShell script I wrote called unattend update.ps1 file. It's on that file share as well. If we go and look, There's the PowerShell file. And all this does is actually pretty simple. Here's the example of the unattended file I use. And what that PowerShell file does is it uses, in this case, Azure. It hooks into an endpoint and it replaces the computer name with the version I get from the Azure RESTful API. You don't have to do that. You can do anything you want. But literally all I do is I load in the unattended answer file, which is stored in that Panther folder I copied it to. And I do a search replace for this just random text string I created with the actual computer name and then write it back out. So in my unattended answer file, there's what I have for the computer name. You could create that using the System Image Manager. I do things like move the page file. I do things like actually setting a policy to auto mount disks. I enable RDP. I set default password. There's a few things I do, and that, again, that's all in the blog article. But fundamentally, that's it. That's really all I'm doing. So I go through, I copy this over, I customize it, and then you would just reboot the machine. And that's it. So I did this playing around in Azure, but I can do it on-prem as well. So I copied this VHD. So all of this content I create in this PE environment, what I actually do is I write this out to a VHD file. So you can see if I scroll all the way up, I use the make PE UFD. I created a 1 gig partition on the VHD file I created. I make the media to the mounted drive of that VHD, and that gives me a VHD file. So throughout, I obviously, as I make all these future changes, I have to go back and recreate that VHD. So I unmounted, create a new VHD, so I just go and run these commands again. But I end up with a VHD file. So then on a Hyper-V server where I test initially, I copy it to a VHD. I attach it to a virtual machine. I create a checkpoint prior to me doing anything so I can roll back to that clean VHD state. If I connect to it, if I start it up, so it's going to boot to Windows PE. It's going to run the startnet.cmd where I've added in my own autolaunch.bat. So there's the default. There it's launching my autolaunch.bat. This is now where it's going to go and clean the disk, create me my 2 partitions, my S and my W. And now mine is still pointed to Azure. So right now it's going to try and pull that WIM file down from Azure. So it's going to be super, super slow based on my connection. If it was running in Azure, it would be much, much faster. If I was running it on-prem, then I would point it to an on-prem file server. And you would customize this however you wanted to. We'll now go through, clean the disk. I can see that finished. That's mapping to my file share in Azure. It's copying over the file, the image install. Now, as you can see, it's going to copy over that image, which is going to take a long time. You'll then do the customization, but I'd reboot into a fully complete image. And that's it. That's the process in action. Again, the key point is just follow the article. It talks through all the different things I do and why I do it. This is just an example. You can really do anything you want. The point was just to explain how PE works and how you can use that to deploy images. If you like this, please follow the channel. Follow me on Twitter, NTFAQ Guy, and a thumbs up would be appreciated. Thank you.